Hello, and welcome to my show. My name is Bret, and this is my channel. So whether you're watching me on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, maybe someday LinkedIn, we might be doing that soon. This is the show every week where sometimes I have guests, like we have today. Sometimes it's just me. Sometimes we're just doing Q&A, talking about containers and DevOps, and you get to ask questions live. Me and my guests get to try to answer them. And before we get to our special guest today, I just want to remind you that this show and other things around my open source, open content, my my podcast that desperately needs updating here soon, all these things are made possible in one part by my Patreon. So to do my little self-plug, basically, this is where you can get all the updates on what I'm doing and creating, all the videos I'm creating, all the blog articles that I post, the open source content I create, the videos I update in my courses. It's all here. And you can buy me a coffee if you'd like every month, be a part of our High Fivers Club, and then you get to be a part of an exclusive monthly Zoom call where we all just hang out and have sort of a water cooler DevOps lunch thing for anyone who's in full-time working in the world of DevOps. But you don't have to buy anything. You can actually go down the bottom here and click follow, and you'll just get my updates. Basically, like once or twice a week, you'll learn about all the new stuff I'm creating. And thank you to all 108 of you that are supporting this show, because it means a lot every month that I'm getting a little bit of that money to justify all this time we spent on the show. And enough with that. So thank you for what you're doing. You can sign up there. Thanks for the patrons. And you also, by the way, can hang out in our Discord chat while we're doing this. I'm on Discord every day now. You can see that little link up there, the devops.fan, that takes you to the Discord chat server, where you can also get exclusive channels for being a Patreon patron. So, welcome to the show, Brandon Mitchell. He's a friend of mine that we've known for 5 years or so. Docker captain and open source volunteer maintainer. And also, I'm just going to throw it up there on the screen. He is the king of Docker on Stackoverflow. He's got
I've been getting some competition lately, though.
Uh-oh. Yeah, there's always competition. Every time we rest on our laurels, someone new shows up. He is in the top 0.04% of Stack Overflow and has answered 1,809 questions on Docker. That's a lot. Oh, well, yeah, as well as Docker files, Docker Compose, Swarm, Linux, all these other things. But yeah, he spends a lot of his time on Stack Overflow. So you've probably, if you've ever asked a question there on Docker or anything related to containers, he may have helped you. It's a good chance. So thank him for that. What's up, man?
Yeah, I've definitely answered a bunch of questions over there. Not all on the same day, so that spread out over a little bit of time there.
Right. So a little bit about Brandon, in case you all have not seen him on the show before, because I think this is like your third or fourth time, maybe.
Second like this, and then we also were at the DockerCon. So
yeah, I count that as one of my shows. Don't tell anybody.
There you go. I count too.
He actually doesn't live that far from me. We live about 3 to 4 hours apart. He actually lives up in Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C. And he's, for most of his career, I mean, he's been working with Docker for a long time, since the beginning. And for most of his career, he's been helping operations teams as a consultant. So we do very similar things. We both help companies operationalize their development and deployment of software and turn it into robots that can do a lot of the work for us and make things go faster. So we've got tons to talk about today. We could make this a 4-hour show and it would just go on and on, but we're not going to do that.
Yeah, sadly, I don't have that much time.
That's right. And you've got to get back to the job of helping other people. But right now, we're going to take your questions. So today we're focused on Registry. And there's a lot of topics to talk about with Registry. And one of the things that Brandon and I were talking about before the show was, how do we narrow this conversation? Because if you're using Docker, if you're creating containers, if you're using Kubernetes, you are having to deal with some sort of registry, probably on a daily basis. So today we're trying to focus the conversation around a new tool that he's created, a set of tools, but really it's about that middle part of your container and image lifecycle. So there are tools that create images. A lot of tools to do that. We're not talking about those. There are tools that help you run images as new containers and manage containers. We're not going to talk about those. We're going to focus the conversation so that way we can get deep and show some examples and demos specifically on managing the push and pull of images, and then when they're on the registry, like dealing with that problem of images on registries. That sound about right?
It does. I spend a lot of my time helping clients out when they're in the developing CI/CD pipelines. And so I tend to see a lot of those challenges where they build the image, they shipped up to a registry, but then they need to do something else extra with it. And so I started building these tools to try to give them that little bit of extra that they tend to ask for. Things like, retagging an image as part of your CI pipeline, or doing some kind of cleanup policy, or copying images back and forth. So I've kind of extended these tools based off of that kind of logic of how do we do this as part of our pipelines.
Yeah. And these are not often, even though we have technically a couple of other tools out there, like Docker does talk to registries. And we've even seen this new experimental tool from them right around the time of your tool called a hub tool, I believe, which is a small start on them trying to do this with Docker. But you've kind of taken it a step further, at least from what I can tell. And you're more focused on maybe that the non, some of this stuff is like user focused, but some of this stuff you're meaning for robots to do, right?
Yeah, it's I would say it's a little bit farther in that I've got a lot more functionality I've built into it, but it's also a little bit narrower in that I'm not digging deep into registry specific API calls in this. This is all generic Docker's registry v2 API they put out there, and I'm going to at some point get more into this with the OCI specs as well. So this is stuff that's going to work hopefully across every registry out there. And so one of the reasons I'd like to chat about and get it out to some of your audience is to say, hey, are there registry servers that some of this stuff doesn't work on? And if so, let's get some issues raised and start digging into that, making sure this is as registry independent as possible.
Yeah. And that's key here too, because when we start talking about registries, we do now have a standard for how these APIs are supposed to work. We continue to see certain applications that, people add layers on top of that to extend the built-in API. But you're focused specifically on the V2 sort of standard that is it? Is the OCI registry standard, or is it distribution standard? I don't even actually know where the spec
they've
lives.
They've got several specs out there under OCI. And so they've got the image spec out there that's been out for a while, and everybody started adding support for that. The distribution spec, though, is what actually implements the registry side of this. And that's
what I'm looking for.
At last check, I'm going down digging this right now. I don't believe they have released it yet. I've been kind of keeping an eye on them, and every once in a while, sometimes somebody hits the button to push a bunch of their videos of their meetings up to YouTube. And so I go checking those out to see what the latest progress is, because this is one I think a lot of people don't realize is not 1.0 yet. And a lot of us would really like to see it get to there.
Is this the one under open containers?
Yep. That's all OCI is open containers.
Yeah. Okay.
And so getting that to 1.0 would mean that we now have a spec for registries to work with. And then so it would be nice to take this tool and say, let's make it not just the Docker v2 registry spec, but also an OCI registry spec. And then within that, they're going to be the images, and the images themselves might be a Docker spec or an OCI spec. You've got that for the contents as well as the overall transportation images.
Right. And I guess it's important to state here, for those that are using Docker and Kubernetes tools every day, that this API spec is how all these, like, it's the one piece that pulls all these pieces of the puzzle together. Like, most of the tools out there are either pushing images or pulling images from a registry, and they're doing that via this API. So this is actually something that we're all already using. We may not be aware of, is it V1, V2, all that kind of stuff. And, is it proprietary to my specific tool and the specific registry that I'm using, like maybe Docker Hub or some other third-party registry or whatever. Like when you're using an ECR registry, you got to deal with AWS's authentication, which is I guess at this point, technically proprietary because it's not used by other registries, and Docker Hub has some of their own extended stuff. So, so you're building tools over under this repo, right? They're all under this regclient repo.
They are. They're all under regclient. It's currently a mono repo, and Crazy Max is in the chat. He's pinged me before saying, hey, let's break it up into individual repos. Haven't done that yet just because I've got a lot of changes I'm planning on making on this stuff. And so I'd like to be able to easily make a lot of breaking changes, basically, and not have all the tools need to coordinate those kind of changes.
Yeah.
But Crazy Max, I do know you want that, and it is coming at some point.
Yeah. So okay. So we have people in chat that know about this, have used it. Hello, Crazy Max. I'm actually catching up on chat at the moment. And by the way, thanks to all of you saying hi. Hello, everyone in chat. Sorry if we didn't call you out specifically. Thanks, Teddy, for buying the course. And Anton uses Port. Port. Is that the one from SUSE? Is that the registry?
Let's see. Portus? I do not know.
Oh, Portus. Right. That's what I'm thinking of. Portus. That's like a wrapper around Docker distribution that you can get as like a GUI manager for the open source Docker registry. And I think it's from SUSE.
Yeah, a lot of these things are all talking the registry v2 spec, and it's interesting if you go down to the spec itself, a lot of these things are listed as optional, and when you start writing tools like this, sometimes you skim over that. And so I've gotten bitten by a few times when I look at, for example, AWS, sometimes they will build their images by hand, custom homegrown with their own tooling. And so you start to realize all these things that even though we're all working on the same spec, if we start building these things with different tools, you start finding those little edge cases that we need to sort out sometimes.
Yeah, I think I was talking to someone in the Docker team recently that it was either Docker or Compose. They were essentially fixing a bug that people were exploiting in a way that it was basically a feature that people were using that they didn't intend, that was causing a problem with the Docker Hub API, and they were trying to resolve. They had to update the tool somehow. I can't remember exactly the context, but yeah, it was one of these things where it's like, well, that's not really in the spec, and we shouldn't really use it that way, so we're gonna have to change Docker so that it doesn't use Hub or the registries in a way that it shouldn't. Yeah, so we're not going to talk about necessarily web management or different ways to deploy registry. Let's just assume you all have a registry, whether you're using Docker Hub or one of the other 1,000 tools out there, Harbor, one of the cloud ones that the clouds have their own now. Portus is one of those few, I think, like Harbor, that it allows you to use. You can deploy your own on your own storage, your own. I don't actually recommend that to most people because, like, running your own registry is work, and ideally, if you can buy one or use a cloud one, like, that's highly recommended. Unless you just have spare time and you want another job, because this is a job. But going back to regclient, so you talked about that there are multiple tools here. What's the elevator pitch? If I'm a developer or someone who works in operations and I have to deal with images, what's the elevator pitch for why I want to go to this repo?
So I started this one off. It kind of built off of my DockerCon talk from last year, where I was talking about creating your own mirror. And so you very often would love to have someone else manage this stuff for you, but some of us, we have things that maybe they aren't in the cloud, or maybe if they are in the cloud, we still want to have a little bit more control of this stuff. And you start spinning up your own registry with your own mirror of some kind of things that are maybe on Docker Hub or any other registry out there. And the way you interact with that from the Docker command line before was you start doing pushes and pulls. And you realize very quickly, especially if you have CI pipelines where all the steps are ephemeral, that if I want to do a update of that image, I want to refresh it, I have to go out there and pull the image upstream and then push it back to my registry. And if nothing changed at all, then that was a whole lot of bytes I pulled back and forth for no reason at all. And so I started making this kind of tooling here that said, let me at least solve that problem to start with. Let me hit that quick little issue of, I just need to either maybe retag an image that's up in a registry, or I want to mirror an image that is on a different registry and get this moved over. And there are a lot of use cases or a lot of scenarios in those commands where you don't need to pull every layer of every image all over again. And since we're just talking to registries and over the registry API, we really shouldn't even need to have a privilege container that you normally have to spin up with the Docker engine that says, okay, let's spin up a privileged Docker engine and then connect to that and say, this Docker engine needs to do the push and pull. We can get all of that out of our CI pipeline and just say, let me just talk to this registry API directly. And it's just an HTTP call, HTTPS, make sure everything's secure. And we're just pulling the layers, but only if we need to. And there's a lot of tricks and tweaks that we can do to make sure that we're not pulling these layers if we don't need to. And that's going to be very handy at some point when you start looking at this stuff and we get into things like the Docker rate limits. If you don't need to pull that image every time, but you can still check it every 5 minutes, you can be updated really quick when something changes, but not hitting your rate limit constantly from all those pulls constantly.
Yeah, that's an important topic. And I'm not sure if your tools were, I mean, they seemed to come out around the time last year that we were talking about rate limits. Was that a motive, like the final straw or motivation for you to do some of this stuff?
So the presentation at Docker Hub was the original motivation.
Oh, your DockerCon talk?
So the rate limits were the motivation for my DockerCon talk because I knew the rate limits were coming even before they came, because Docker likes to sometimes leak this stuff to the captains so we can tell them that the community is going to pull the pitchforks out if they try to do that. And so they gave us a hint that this stuff was coming down. They need to find some way to do it. And so I came up with my DockerCon talk that said, let's find a better way to do that. And then roughly around the same time that they were coming out with the rate limits, I was starting to have this stuff coming out about the same time, give or take. So very, very early on when they started adding their rate limits on their side, I started picking off those API calls and starting to embed that in the tool as well so that we could start to see these rate limits within the tooling itself.
Yeah. So. By the way, people, in case you didn't know, let me find the right button. This is actually a really great idea, by the way. You have a side topic. You have an entire repo just on your presentations. I'm going to put that in chat. So there's something, I appreciate talks that are people solving their own problem rather than talking about a product or, teaching people on a product, which is a lot of what I do. But both of us have done DockerCon talks where we had a problem, we implemented a solution, we may have created something, or we had to implement someone else's solution to solve a problem. And we felt it was complex enough that we should tell other people about it, and we made a whole talk about it. And you do that really well. In fact, I reference your stuff year over year, like your captain's tips is great, and all that stuff is in here. So everyone, go check out. So what he's talking about is his 2020 Docker registry mirroring and caching talk. So you can see all of that. And then you can also get to his tips and tricks. I still reference that for some of the stuff that I didn't know about volumes back in the day around how to basically make named volumes that are to a different location, all these different sort of hacks that you can, not really hacks, but ways that you can exploit the Docker volume tooling that I didn't know about, especially in YAML. And that was really cool. And I send it to my clients all the time because they're always trying to do stuff with Docker that isn't exactly in the help. And a lot of that stuff in there is great. You also, I think, are the one that mentioned to me the first time that I had a little shell script that would automatically clean up images. And I think you mentioned to me that, yeah, this may be a problem if you were actually downloading images for a new app that you were deploying while that script happened to be running. Which caused me to talk about it on this channel, which caused someone in chat to actually give me a PR that on my other on one of my repos where I show off this script that does auto image cleanup, it only looks for images older than 24 hours now because of someone else's contribution. And so it's a great example of like, we're in the open, this is all open source, people are improving other people's stuff all the time, and how even if we're just talking about it, other people will learn from it and make it better. So yeah.
And it comes full circle because one of those tips and tricks actually came from your talk of doing that image cleanup. I took your little run a service, run a container. It just has a shell script in there. It just runs every 24 hours or whatever it is and does that. Yep. I completely ripped that one off and put that in my tips and tricks and then made sure to credit you down below and said,
yeah, of course you did. You're a nice guy. And so for people that don't know, let's back up a second. About a year ago, Docker started making they started notifying us that they were going to start limiting last fall, so last autumn, October timeframe, November timeframe. They started rate limiting so that that top 1% of people that are using Docker images without paying for them and without logging in would hit limits. And that then created this whole discussion around how we as practitioners need to be a little bit more responsible with shared resources on the internet, and that we need to implement something called a pull-through cache. And we're probably going to get to demos later and talk about that. But for those of you out there, if you are not aware of pull-through cache, you definitely want to basically hang out with us for a little bit, because you're going to probably have to deal with that. You're probably, if you've been using Docker Hub this whole time or some other registry this whole time, at some point, you're going to realize that you maybe need some extra layer of protection as well as caching for performance and bandwidth and all those other reasons. And that's not exactly intuitive. Like, to even get that set up isn't just a 5-minute thing. Your clients have to change. You have to set up servers and do things on servers. So let's start breaking these down. I know you brought some demos, so I don't want to chit chat too long, and let's maybe dive into.
I want to dig in. I want to dig in a little bit on the pull-through cache, though, because that goes back to the talk. And there are two schools of thought on this one. There is the let's get the really easy button out there, which is the spin up a pull-through cache. And Docker has that built into the registry code today. And I've kind of chatted with them on the side, and there's thoughts maybe we can make this a little better. We can fork it off on a little side project. Not sure when or if any of that might happen, but when you do the pull-through cache, every time you do your image pull, it doesn't necessarily go all the way upstream and reset and make sure that the upstream image has been refreshed at that point. So it does have a little bit of a lag. Whenever something updates upstream, you might miss some of that lag. And then whenever it does do that check, it's kind of a hard check at that point. You're definitely going to check upstream to make sure that that image is there. And if you've hit the rate limit at that exact moment, if you have maybe something went down, you have an outage or something like that, you don't start using the stale images, I don't believe. And so it's not a very tunable, configurable tool. And the last thing that was a challenge for me with all of that was that it didn't handle the private images very well. And so if you had a private repo that you wanted to pull from with the pull-through cache, either you wouldn't do it with the pull-through cache, or you had to put your credentials on that cache, and that meant anybody that could touch that cache could also grab your private images as well, because default, usually the pull-through cache isn't set up to authenticate anything from the client side back. It was only authenticating, hey, I'm a pull-through cache, let me authenticate to the Docker Hub to pull these images. Right. So that was one school of thought. The other school was to say, let's just make our own mirror manually, these things. And so a lot of this tooling that we're going to talk about today is to say, what if we started to make our mirror, and what would it take to manage that mirror? And how can we make that easier?
Right. Yeah, because, I mean, at the end of the day, really, mirroring and caching, like these are all protections that, if you're relying on images as your major source of how you update code, if a container fails or a server dies, these things all still need to work. And we've got so many tools out there, but none of them seem to focus explicitly on this problem of, hey, I don't really want a harbor, right? I don't need a fancy solution like that necessarily. Maybe some people do. Some people eventually go there. But I just need a simple mirror. Yeah, a simple mirror or a simple pull-through cache. What is my easiest way to do that? That is a question that I don't have an answer to. And to be fair, I haven't watched your DockerCon talk, so I should do that. Step one. So yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Should we start demoing some stuff?
Let's demo. But no, it's actually been a while since we've demoed. I've had a guest demo, so this is kind of all new.
So you're pointing out that I've got that presentation repo, and I've got PR that has not gone up into that yet. That'll be the next talk that I'm going to have pushed up there, which is for the regclient and regctl and some of these other tools.
Oh, nice.
So I've got an empty environment right now and a bunch of commands and everything I'm going to kick off here in a bit. But you can see from the PS, there's nothing in there. I've got 2 images I pulled just because I'm trying to speed up the beginning of this demo. No network. So let's make a network, because any good Docker person, when they start to do this stuff, they want to have a network out there. And I'm going to spin up a registry. And I've got a bunch of different options on this thing. I'll just start up here and then I'll kind of hit a couple of these options real quick. It's got the file system that says, hey, drop all your files over in this one directory. And then I believe, I've got the little volume down here that says store that for later. That just makes it so when this thing gets recreated or restarted or something like that, I've got that same data from before I do enable deletes and validation. I've ran into some issues when I started mirroring some Windows images because Microsoft, you don't actually get the layers of the Microsoft images from the Docker Hub registry. They actually go over to Microsoft server for that one. There's like an external URL in there. And so you need to validate that URL. And I need to talk with some Docker people to figure out how I can properly validate. But for now, I'll just turn that off. So
by the way,
with that, I've got a...
By the way, that's an excellent point you brought up that someone asked me the other day, and I didn't have an answer for them. For the Microsoft images on Hub, they do seem to be pointing externally, and someone wanted to know how could they do that. And I was like, I don't actually know. Could you just make your own custom manifest and then push it to Hub, and then that's all you need?
Yeah, there's some very low level stuff you can do for that one. I've never tried to do it, so that's a good question of, what would break and what it might take to implement that. It's not something you're going to find support from out of the box from any of the Docker tools. So this would be something you're making your own custom image to do that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Not that didn't want to sidetrack too far. I didn't realize that, and then when I did, someone was like, "Hey, I want to do that. I want to store my images somewhere else, but I want them listed on Docker Hub." Essentially, is what that kind of ends up being. But I think that's a special deal that either Microsoft set up or they worked with Docker specifically on. I don't know.
Well, because of that validation, I wouldn't be surprised if you try to do that if Docker Hub says, "Hey, that's not a valid upstream registry you're pointing to," and so you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Just because they've probably got that check in there more than likely. So everything I'm doing today, I'm doing it in containers. So I've got the image sitting out there. I actually pushed a patch to it just yesterday when I was running through some of these commands and realized I had one little tweak in there I wanted to make. So I'm just going to run this as a function instead of actually building the binary locally and using the locally built binary. And the function is just going to kick off a Docker container. I'm going to put it on the same network as the registry. So instead of saying that I'm going to talk to localhost for any of my registry commands when I run regctl, I'm going to specify that I'm talking to the machine called registry. So I'm going to talk container to container between these things. And I'm storing the config in there. So I've got a little config file that just keeps track of what registries I've logged into and any credentials connect into that, and whether it needs to be TLS or HTTP or something like that. By default, we're always looking for a TLS connection, HTTPS. That's the way Docker registries are. And so with that, if I was to try to list this registry, what you would see is that out of the box, that ain't going to work because I got HTTPS. I was looking for HTTPS and I got HTTP because the registry that I spun up here up top was not with a TLS certificate. So you might have seen it before. You've ever done any of these Docker commands before. That's coming from Go itself. And so we can fix this. So my first fix is to say, let me just set this registry of registry 5000. Let me just say that TLS disabled and my scheme is HTTP instead of HTTPS. So if I run that and kick that command off there, I'm going to do one other command. I've got a little hub token specified over here, and my hub user, because everybody is probably curious what my username is not specified. So let me export that. Sudo image. If I can get it with a dash or an underscore, I put it in there. Docker Hub is one of those places that doesn't like me to do that.
Right.
They say no dashes, no hyphens, nothing like that.
Oh, yeah.
So
no special characters? All right.
No special characters at all, just alphanumeric.
Even
so now
though
I've got that specified.
That
they really aren't. You'd think they would be pretty straightforward. So now I've got that. I've got this command now. Let me just list this repo. And it should come back and just say there's nothing in there. Completely empty registry. We haven't done anything yet. So I kind of threw out a couple scenarios to start with. And the first one I'm going to start with is I'm going to do a regctl command, and I'm going to copy. I'm actually copying the exact same image just because I want to get my pull count up there on Docker Hub and make it look like people like this image out there. So everybody says, hey, it's a really awesome image. Everybody should use it. And I'm going to copy that image to my local registry. And so this is just, in this case, it's an image that I already have pulled local, but I'm not looking at anything local in the Docker engine here when I do this. I'm talking API to API from the upstream Docker registry at Docker Hub to my local one. And I'm expecting to see some output there. So we'll see. Kind of hanging on me.
So, okay, right. So this doesn't require...
Yeah, go ahead.
Like you could have this running in a CI solution, some sort of automated solution and there's no other than having two registries in two different places. Is that what you're saying? Like you don't need any. There's no other. You don't have to have Docker installed. I mean, in your example, you're running another registry locally, but it could very well be one in your data center, that kind of thing.
Yeah. This can be talking any registry back and forth between either. Let me do real quick. I'm going to do a quick reset on this thing, just because I think you do a Docker PS and grep for my Docker and Docker instances, and I've got a couple of these things up and running. So let me kill the 4375. My guess is because before we were on this show, before we jumped on the show, we said, hey, you know what? Let's make sure my VP and other stuff isn't running. And I'm betting when I did that I probably broke the networking. Okay, so that is now gone. If anybody has ever played with, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say while you're looking at that. So interestingly enough, okay, so like this reg control, is that how we say it?
I say regctl because I think we have been split apart so much by this pandemic. I think it is time that we all just kind of embrace the cuddle.
Right, embrace the cuddle. All right, I like it. So regctl. Because we've got multiple CLIs to look at, but one of the things that regctl can do is copy an image from one registry to another, which even if you did Docker, interestingly, Docker, like we've all probably written scripts or had to deal with automating a Docker pull rather, a Docker tag, and then a Docker push. And that is an amazingly complex thing to do because it then it assumes you have a Docker engine daemon running in the background somewhere. It will then copy the entire image locally and then store it in your cache. And then when you push it somewhere, it will push it to that place. And then you have to probably clean up your local cache because you maybe don't want to fill up your local storage on whatever system you're using. So I can see why this is like one of your top things, because when you're working in CI, you don't always have a Docker daemon. You don't always have a ton of storage. You don't always have your CI pipelines don't always sit around forever, so you don't have this long running thing that you can always deal with. And we've often wished we had these easy little tools that could just do automated stuff with a registry without any other additional requirements other than that single binary living somewhere in my CI solution. So this is neat. I'm liking it.
Yeah, and it's not just that it's a single binary is living there. It's shipped as an image. So if you have a lot of these CI tools that like GitHub, GitLab, a whole bunch of these CI tools out there, with the exception kind of quasi of Jenkins, because Jenkins likes to make its own little DSL. A lot of them just say, give us your Docker image to run, and we're going to run it in CI with whatever parameter, whatever commands you want to run inside of it. And so all this stuff runs very nicely within those kind of scenarios. And so what you saw back there, a whole bunch of these things running, it was a whole bunch of copy layer, copy config, copy another layer, copy another layer. It was copying all those pieces back and forth. And you saw a whole bunch of them. The image of that copy wasn't really all that big, but I'll show you in a little bit that there was a lot more happening behind the scenes than normally what you would see with a Docker push and a Docker pull. So I'm going to get to that in a little bit, but just kind of want to give you an idea that we just now mirrored an image that was originally up on Docker Hub locally to my little local registry. The next command I wanted to kick off here was to say, let me, instead of doing a copy from Docker Hub, let me just copy between one repo to another repo on the same registry. And this is just, you would still have to do a push and a pull normally with Docker commands, but now if I ran this just like that just kind of flew there. And what was happening under the covers, if I turn on debugging, you would have seen it. But these commands ran really quick because it didn't actually copy anything. All the stuff under the covers, all it was doing was just saying, hey, registry, take that layer that's sitting over in this other repo on the same registry and just do a little soft copy. And it's kind of, think of it like a symbolic link on registry land that happens server side. So we didn't actually have to push or pull any of these layers to move from one repo to another repo on the same registry, because the registries have that intelligence in there.
So it's grabbing the SHA of each one of those layers and then sort of mapping it or associating.
Yeah, and it tells the registry directly, hey, registry, grab this layer from this other repo, and the registry comes back and says, oh yeah, I can do that. I'll take care of that for you. And so we never had to download and pull and push that layer when we did that second time there. And we can even get better than that. This third one here, I'm just saying within that, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. So the way that regctl knows how to do that is when the URL is specifying the same host, like, or the tag rather is the same host. Server. Yeah. Okay. It just goes, if these match, I'm just going to do this. I'm not actually going to download tarbals or whatever. So yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. And it tries, if it doesn't work, then it'll fall back and actually pull the layers. So if for some reason the registry server says, hey, I don't support that API call, then we fall back. But at least for this just really speeds up the process, especially when you're thinking you might have a staging repo and a production repo, and the production repo has a lot more lockdown on the ACLs. You can have this kind of copy going back and forth. It's just all server side, nothing for the client to do. And so we didn't actually have to pull those layers down to get this thing moved from one repository to another.
Okay.
So that was number 2. And then here's the third one, which is, let me kind of throw a couple more lines in there, which is I'm just going to copy or retag. So I've got the same, I just took the latest tag and I just called it stable now. And when I do that, it's probably going to come back, I think, with nothing at all. It did something, but there was just nothing output because there was just, all we did was we just tweaked one little flag on the server side. So you might be looking at that and saying, okay, what do we actually do? Because no output, no commands, nothing else happening there. Let's see. I now started with nothing. And now if I say, show me all the repos on this registry server, I now see that I have my little regctl image that I pulled down. And the other one, when I moved it to your user, I've got the little your user regclient regctl there. So I've got 2 different repos. And if I dig into that, I can start looking at the tags that are up there on the registry server. Again, we're running these commands from local here, and I can see that I've got a stable and the latest. So now you can see that actual retag there did work. It did retag that image. And then we start doing some of the stuff that you're asking.
Yeah. So so far we've got regctl image copy, and there's 3 ways that this copy command can work. It can either literally copy the layers of the image from one location to another. It can associate layers of a new image you're creating, or not a new image you're creating, but you're creating an association between images like a symlink. And the third one is we're just going to retag this image because that's kind of what you would do with a promotion, right? Where if quite often my teams they're in CI, they're doing testing on an image, so they don't want that to be the official image anyone depends on. Maybe they do reuse the latest image, and that's really just meant for like convenience of developers to find what, or whatever. Some of my teams will actually use the prod label as a convenient human label for reusing, so that if anyone ever wants to know what's running in the production environment and just pull down the exact same code, they don't have to go like look up the SHA hash or whatever is it really in production, or look up real server stuff. They can just pull the production image. So these are all, in my mind, that's a level of promotion or a type of promotion where we're saying this image that already is there, it's now it needs some other information. And if we had other ways to label things, we could maybe use those, but all we have is tags. So we're retagging that image. And those are common everyday, like people that I think do this in production, they all are having to deal with these problems. Like this is an everyday problem for a lot of people.
They really do. And so I just turn this, there's a whole bunch of, text all over the screen. But this is when I turn debugging on, you can start to see each one of these individual API calls going out. And so I'm sending, let me do a head request against this thing, and getting back, and it says, hey, the copy isn't needed because when I did the head on those 2 different repos out there, I just saw that, hey, that thing came back the same. So let me just do a put request. So under the covers, this thing is doing all those checks back and forth of, do I need to do this copy? Do I need to move these layers around? And when I'm doing some of these things between different repositories, when I ran that one to the your repo and specify something like that, what you end up seeing from those same things instead of the copy not needed is that it's doing, a blob copy on the server side. And it's actually sending, it does this post request, and it just says, in this post request, grab from this other repo, this URL. And so I didn't actually send any data. I just said, hey, just copy this thing over. And it just did this little mount command from another repo of that same blob. And the registry server came back and it said, hey, we've got that layer already over there, so we can do that. We don't have to have you pull that layer and push it back and forth to us. We can do this all server side. So that was
Very cool.
getting deep into the weeds there for a lot of people, but it's all there if you're interested.
We did have a question in chat. Is that rate limit command you have up there, the regclient image rate limit, is that a Docker Hub specific thing?
The rate limit is looking at an API call that's coming back. I've only ever seen this implemented in Docker Hub.
Okay.
But the call itself doesn't necessarily have to be Docker Hub specific. But if you run this against any other repo out there, like here I'm querying it and I get back those rate limits. If I was to query my local registry here, RAGI, now you get to see how I can't spell if I'm not copy and pasting. So if I query my local one, it's just going to come back and say, hey, you know what? There is no rate limit set. It is false. Where up here it said, hey, there is a rate limit that's set on this server. So this command will work against any registry, but I don't think I've ever seen any other public registry implement this yet. But who knows? Maybe they will now that they're seeing all the users from Docker Hub coming over and flooding their registries.
So there are people that take my courses, and there are customers or clients of mine that at some point will hit these limits, right? If they're using Docker Hub, they might hit it in Kubernetes in their local Docker, and it would be really interesting. Like, there's a common enough occurrence of this that I feel like there should be an automated little tool. Maybe we can work out something later where you just run this image, and it will somehow like find all the images that you are, all of the repos rather that you own or whatever that account owns or something, and then goes and checks all the rate limits. And then if less than 10% is left, that we can kick off a web call to Slack or something, like a webhook rather. So because there's not, even though this stuff is available, it's not very visible to the normal user. And depending on the versions of your apps or the version of your client tools, you're never going to see this, or you might get an ambiguous error that's not obvious. And these rate limits are real. I mean, especially if you're behind a corporate firewall, which so many of my customers still are, and they might even have to go through a single VPN of the company to get to certain access stuff. So they're all sharing the same IP address, which is how they're rate limited a lot of times. So yeah, this is a big deal, and I think people they don't think about it at all until they hit the limit, and then they have to learn about what the limits are, how to deal with them, how to mitigate it. So it's cool that we, at least in this case, we're just getting back a JSON table, but or JSON array.
And it's JSON. I got to look up my format string to put a new line feed in there, but I can format this output however I want to. And so I can just specify, hey, give me that rate limit back within something like that. And so we could start doing maybe some math in there, putting some other checks. You can do those sorts of things you're looking at, automate that just right on top of this tool, just to say, hey, let me run this command periodically in the background. This rate limit doesn't, you've seen me run it a half dozen times here, and it's been 162 each time, ever since the start of this beginning after I pulled that first image. So I'm only doing a head request. I'm not actually pulling an image.
And that's a good point to mention to people. We did a whole show on this. In case you're curious about rate limits in Docker Hub, we have in this live show on YouTube, you just go to bret.live, you can go back in the episodes, and we covered at least an entire episode, maybe multiple episodes, talking about Docker Hub rate limits and talking a little bit about this hub. They basically, refresh my memory if I'm wrong, they added abilities, especially into Docker itself, so that for a lot of this work, we don't have to pull images. We can just do the header of an HTTP request, the head, and that would give us, it reduces the bandwidth. It's the smallest level of like a set of packets that we can get back to make decisions on and do things. And it also doesn't go against your rate limit, which is awesome because traditionally the Docker tool to do some of these things, just to like retag an image, would affect your rate limits because it has to pull all this stuff down, then it has to push. Yeah, so yeah, it's cool.
Yep. And in fact, when you see this stuff, I've got the remain down to 162 there. It's when I do some of these commands here, like these copy commands, I'm not just pulling one image. It's because it's based off of the manifest. And so when we're doing these commands, we can query that manifest, and that's a very small query, but Docker counts that as one pull as soon as you touch that manifest for the whole image, even though you haven't pulled any layers yet. So you have to be careful with it. And when you get into multi-platform images, I have to make sure I say the right term because I usually try to say multi-arch images, and Docker's like, well, it's multi-platform, not multi-arch. When you
I
get
say
into those
multi-arch too.
multi-platform images,
Yeah.
it's so easy. When you get into those, let me start with this. So I pulled down my little regclient image here. If I kick this command off, this is going to show you under the behind the scenes what Docker sees, which is there's a config object and there are a bunch of these layers. So this under the covers is a manifest. This is what you're pulling from Docker Hub when you pull an image, and then it then goes and says, let me go grab this digest for the config. Let me go grab each of these layers down, pull those down. Those are individual blobs that's pulling down afterwards. But this query on that manifest was actually pulling that image down. But that's only half the description, because this was actually a multi-arch image or multi-platform. I'm going to get it right here in a bit. If I run this command with the list option, you can actually see all the different, let me even make this bigger so you don't get the funny line wraps. You can see that, hey, we pulled down the Linux for 386. We pulled down the AMD 64 for Linux. We pulled down the ARM for v6. We pulled down all these different platforms. And this is on the local copy that we have in our local registry. Normally, if you were to do a Docker pull and a Docker push, the Docker pull is going to dereference that image to your local platform and only copy your one architecture over. And so when I do this regctl copy command, I'm now copying all the architectures. And that's why when we looked up above and you saw all those layers getting copied over, it was because we were making a full mirror of that image. All the platforms, everything was getting copied, not just your one platform.
Yeah, because if you were simply just wrapping in Docker commands in some sort of automated tool, unless you specified the -- platform in those commands, you're right. It would, whatever server you ran it on or machine you ran it on, which is usually 64-bit Linux, or x86 64, depending on where you look. By the way, that stuff is so inconsistent, frustrating between the visualization on Docker Hub calling it x86 64, the manifest file calling it ARM 64 or AMD 64. The internet calls it x64. Like it's all the same thing, but we need to standardize or something. It's frustrating.
I'm sure Intel hates that we all call it AMD 64.
I know, right? Well, they hate a lot of things right now. Like, there's not a lot of good news coming out of Intel.
They really are. So yeah, that's how we get this full thing that covers all of it. So now if you're doing development on like your local Raspberry Pi, these images that you mirror down are going to work both for your laptop and for your Mac M1 and for your Raspberry Pi, because you pull down all the different variants of that image instead of just the one with the pull command.
Yeah.
And then, so we saw that manifest, and up top of the manifest, it had that little config object. If I run an image inspect, and again, I'm just going to go full screen again here, just because it's easier to see full screen. When I run this should look very familiar to people that do a Docker image inspect instead of a regctl image inspect. Just doing a Docker image inspect, you're going to see pretty much the same output. And it's going to say, hey, this was created on a certain date. It's for this OS. We've got all these labels on it on this image. So maybe we wanted to grab one of these labels. I'll come back to that in a second. And here are the different layers that are part of it. The history of all the build steps. I like using build kit, so you see build kit all over my images. This is all the stuff we're looking at. We're querying it from the registry. We didn't actually have to pull down the image and all the layers to query this stuff. So if, for example, I wanted to look at one of those layers, one of the labels, and said, let me get the image version label, just because I want to see, query my registry and see what the latest image version is up on that registry right now. I can do that, and I can format this output to pull just that one little detail. And so you can see there at the beginning of our prompt there, I pull down v0.2.1. And so I can check that without actually having to do a Docker pull. And so now I know, do I need to do a pull? Or we saw a good presentation this last DockerCon. Who was it? Andy Klemenko was doing an interesting presentation showing some other similar tooling to this, where he was putting all of his information of how to run this image into those labels. And so he would pull down the command to run the image from this other command. And so everything was pushed up to the registry, including the command to run it. So it was kind of this little inception thing. So we've now got that same feature over here.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
and you have delete.
So the next thing,
by the way, delete is not a thing in Docker.
Yeah. So when I get to my presentation at some point, not on this call, but whenever I finish the presentation up and push it online later on, when I get to the deleting images part, I say, we've got the we got the mirroring image command where you just say a pull and a tag and a push, and we got the retagging command. And when you get to the deleting images, there's this Docker question mark and then some swear words coming after it, because there is no command to delete an image in a registry from Docker itself.
Yeah.
So once you have something up in a registry, this is why when I started the registry up, I had to pass that extra flag that says, let's at least enable the delete, because out of the box it's not enabled. But then it's even more complicated than that. There is not an API call to delete tags. And you cannot delete a tag by an API call. This doesn't exist. So when I run this thing, this actually doesn't exist, except it does. And I had to implement a little bit hacky. You can delete a manifest. You can delete that SHA for that whole manifest, but that will delete that SHA and every tag that points to that SHA. And so if you have, like, our stable and our latest image are the same right now, if I was to run some digest commands down below, I'll get to. If I was to do this on an image delete, this would delete all the tags that are pointing to the same thing instead of just the one tag. And so when I do this way, though, this is actually going to delete just the one tag. If I run that command, it's going to come back and say, okay, it's gone. And if I run the tag ls command again here and say, show me the tags that I've got running there, it's going to say, I've got the debug tag that I created earlier, and I showed the debug output, and the latest tag. These are all the same SHA. They're all the same manifest, but now I delete that one tag. And the way I had to do that was actually push a fake image up there first with a different manifest. So I got a different SHA up there, and then delete that fake SHA. So I kind of pushed a little temporary. It was basically an empty image, no layers in it. But I just had to push something different so I could get the tag to point somewhere else, and then I could delete that other thing.
Yeah.
So
is this? I'm just going to guess that there's like on the distribution repo. There's a GitHub issue of people saying, "Please give us a way to delete with a single API call."
If you look at the OCI v1 spec, that is one of the things they're talking about. I don't know if they're going to do it, but it is definitely one of the things they have been discussing. Of people have complained about that before. It has definitely been an issue. I'm not the first person that's run into that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that comes into play in future.
I mean, all registry web interfaces have a delete button, so I got to wonder what they're doing in the background. They're probably doing something similar.
Yeah,
that was a neat hack, though. I was like, yeah, I don't know how you're gonna do that.
You're like, how does he do this? Yeah, it was one of those things where I was pacing the room for a while saying, how do I do this? Because Docker didn't do it, and I hate deleting. You might have the case I get into later on is I'll have a automatic retention policy where I say, let me go through and do a retention policy for all the automatically built CI images, just like the nightly builds or the things that are just built constantly and then run through the test. Because I might go through and retag those later on. It says, this is the image that went all the way to production or staging or past all the normal tests. And so we're ready to call this something that we want to actually keep for a while. So we retag it. And I want to have a policy that can say, let me delete everything that only made it to that first step and clean those up, because a bunch of those aren't important. But I don't want to accidentally delete something that was important.
Right.
And so to try to implement that kind of policy, I need to be able to delete the tag and not the entire manifest.
Yeah.
So there was a challenge there. So I showed this last command here I was running while we were chatting, this image digest command. Anytime we want to look up and say, what is the current digest for an image, we can run that and actually get that SHA value so that we can then do other commands. And so I mentioned earlier, if we tried to do a delete, I'll show you this delete in a second here. If I compare, I was looking at the latest, if I compare that, whoops, I always do that. That's what happens when I do the shift copy instead of the regular copy. If we compare those two digests, the D187, it's the same digest for two different images. This is the stable and the other one was latest. So I can actually show you that scenario I was just talking about. I've got the image delete command here, and you have to specify a digest when you do a delete. So if I run this command now, kick that off, it's going to say that I did something wrong, invalid reference format. Did I not specify digest? I did, so I must type something funny there. Interesting. This is when we get those funny demo fails. Let me just try echoing that and see what I'm actually trying to run. Curiouser and curiouser, because that looks like a valid format to me.
It does. It does look.
I'm just wondering if I have like a funny character at the end or something weird. See if I got anything funny back and forth. I do have something funny at the end there. Okay, let me copy and paste this instead of trying to do the variable thing. So let's do it the old-fashioned way.
Old school way.
We're going to go back to actually copying and pasting strings like we were meant to. So if I run it that way, and then I actually put my closing quote on there because I put an open quote in this command. Let me try that again. It's going to fail because I can't type anything right. Let's try this 1/3 time here. Okay. There we go. That took a little effort.
Nice. So basically, so now we have regctl tag delete, and we have regctl image delete. And the tag, so when you do the image delete,
they're gone.
Is the repo gone?
So the repo still exists. I didn't get an error that the repo doesn't exist, but
yeah,
all those images that we were up there working with, they were all the same image.
Right.
So I wasn't doing any, you know, I'm trying to be nice to my Docker Hub pull limits right now. And so
okay, so the use case here is if you just have a bunch of tags that you want to get rid of all at the same time because they're all referencing the same thing, you can sort of, instead of having to list all those tags in a bunch of different tag delete commands, you could just delete the image directly. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah. I think the other way to think about it is this was that other case we were talking about earlier where if I was to delete the manifest instead of deleting the tag, this is what happens.
Okay.
Which is that, you know, we just nuked all of those tags, even though, you know, we might have thought that we were pulling just one tag for the latest. When we delete an image, it's not just that one image, it's every tag that points to that same image.
Okay.
So it's slightly different. So that is, in a nutshell, regctl. So that is the command line way to do a bunch of this stuff. So I don't know how much longer you want to run your show, Bret, because I can go for a long while here, but I've got a couple other tools that I might want to talk about, at least at a high level.
Yeah, let's do it. We got time.
Yeah. So the second tool here that I was working on was I said, okay, this is all great, but this turns into a lot of bash shell scripting here. And I think a lot of people that come out doing this stuff, they say, well, our real use case is that we just want to mirror something. We just want to take a source and a target and maybe want to do like a backup policy and back up the old image before we overwrite it with a new version of the image so that we can maybe something changed upstream. I've had more than enough times where I'm depending on something like latest. And if I'm depending on latest, then I want to make sure that A, I get the newest latest, but B, in case latest breaks something, I've got a way to go back. And normally you don't have that option. When someone changes something upstream, it's changed upstream and you got to go find that SHA or something like that to pull. So here I'm actually going through and specifying, okay, let me just at least keep one backup of this stuff. And I could get fancier. I could put date stamps and all kinds of crazy stuff. But let me take this entire file and I'm just going to, I was going to say I'm going to write this to a file over here, but if I cd into my preso folder, I've got the Regsync and the Regbot one here that I'm going to talk about later on. I've got these YAML files already written. So assume that I just did a VI and wrote this Regsync command. And so now I'm going to kick off another command altogether. And this command is a Regsync command instead of regctl command. And let me make this bigger so you don't have the funny line wrappings going on, just to walk through this a second. I'm mounting in that Regsync YAML as a config file, and I'm just calling it home app user. Inside my containers, I don't run as root, and so the commands are all run within this little app user there. And I've got a little hub token that I mount in there because I don't want to put my credentials inside the image or anything funny like that. I don't want to pass it as environment variable, so I'm just passing as a file. Inside swarm mode, you would pass it as a secret. Inside of Kubernetes, you would pass that as a secret. And the user ID itself, I don't care. So I just pass that as an environment variable. That's not supposed to be secure. And then I'm running the sync command, and I pass it the config, and I'm passing it the option here is just once. And so when I run this thing once, what you're going to see is kick this guy off. And again, I will pull this up full screen. I should probably just leave them both full screen. But I was going to pull this image down because I was lazy. I didn't run that ahead of time. And this is going through and it's just copying all those layers over, moving all those images. So all those different reg commands we would have run before, And while that's running, let me show you a little bit more of what's going on with that config file. We said, let me grab the image for BusyBox latest, but I'm also grabbing the latest, the version 3 and the 3 dot anything for the Alpine image. And I think at this rate, I'll probably end up hitting my rate limit at some point here, knowing me. I'm also grabbing the regctl as well, and it's going to look at regctl and say, I've already got that. But we're going through and we're copying all these images, all these different layers, and we don't have to know that it's now 3.12 or 3.13 or whatever the latest version of Alpine is. It's just going to go out there and list all the tags and figure that out for us. And it's also going out and saying, do we already have the regclient, regctl from before? Are we getting ready to overwrite that? Let's not overwrite that. So let's not do that. And then all the debugging output, you can also see that it's saying, there are a bunch of these layers that I don't need to copy. And so I need to synchronize the 3 image over there. But when it started to do that, it probably already had those images from the 3 dot whatever the most recent version was. So it didn't need to do that a second time. So it's all those layers there and just sped that part up. So ran a whole bunch of stuff. We copied a whole bunch of images over. I'm having fun just blowing my rate limit out the window there.
All right. So let me summarize real quick there. So so Regsync, a separate binary that you can either run directly or you can run it through an image you've created. So it's a tiny little image, probably, I'm guessing. And are these? I'm assuming these are like these images that you have. They're like single binary images. They're not actually like running on Alpine or BusyBox or anything.
So I've got 2 versions of the image. One version, the one that I'm using right here, is just a Golang single binary. The other one is that same Golang single binary in Alpine. And the reason I do that is for people that run this in CI platforms, sometimes they need a binsh and some other stuff within the container to run their CI commands.
Right.
And so I just included a little minimal environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so does this run as it looks like it was a one-shot deal. Does it also run as like a daemon?
That was the once, and so what I'm getting ready to show you now is the daemon that runs with a -d, restart, I give it a name, I give it all that stuff, and so I can just kick this off here. Now, this is going to be super quiet. It's not going to, I'm just throwing the background, and if I was to look at the logs, in fact, let me pull those up, you'll see that there's absolutely nothing there. This was the container name I specified was Regsync, and it's just going to show nothing. And that's because when you run this stuff as a server, and I had a schedule, and so I said, this thing just needs to run every 60 minutes. When I run this stuff on a schedule, it doesn't kick off until that 60 minutes gets reached. Okay. I can specify this on an interval. I can also specify this with like a cron syntax. So you can say to run this at the top of the hour every 15 minutes with the /15 notation, those kind of things. You can specify it either with like an interval based off of when this command started up or with the cron syntax, however you need to do those 2 options there. And then, like you're looking for, this just runs as a service in the background, constantly running, constantly keeping the stuff updated. So you always have an image, or you always have your local registry that has these images that you're looking for, constantly updated.
Yeah. I mean, there's already teams that I can think of that I'm working with that they're dealing with 2, possibly even 3 different registries that they're managing. One in the cloud, one in the data center, and then hub. And they have implemented this kind of automation with a lot of their own tooling, a lot of scripts, a lot of workarounds and hacky kind of stuff. And this is great stuff. I'm impressed by the YAML idea, because that's a really interesting idea of keeping things in sync through a YAML config that you just throw at a one-shot or a binary for a server kind of thing. That's pretty neat.
If we're doing anything with Docker, at some point it all goes back to YAML. We can't help it.
Right.
So it's one way or another we're going there. I do have in here checks for the rate limit. So if we try to pull from a registry and that registry has rate limits enabled, this will automatically stop doing its syncs when it starts hitting that rate limit.
So don't break everyone else.
They're always 100. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Don't have my backup sync breaking my client usage, assuming that they're the same account. Yeah.
I mean, we're making a mirror of the registry. So theoretically, you've got an image that you pulled before that's still there. It's just a little bit stale. So keep at least a few pulls for some of these different images that aren't in the mirror for the developers to use. And this is just this will catch up whenever it catches up.
Yeah, it's nice.
So
You're being it's a good citizen option there. I like that.
I try to. I really try to. And then the Docker files here, when I make my Docker files, I showed this in my presentation before, but I just specify, I pass the registry as an argument. My from line has the registry there. In case you don't know, Docker IO, that is the short name, or that's the kind of shorthand notation for Docker Hub whenever you're making that for your registry name. And then if you pull an image that is not within a specific user's repo, it's under library. And so when I'm saying grab the Alpine image, this is the long name of Alpine is Docker IO library Alpine. And then when I start to do my builds, I can just pass a build arg that says, let me use my local registry. And so this same Docker file that works easily if I want to push this up to Docker Hub and other people can use it, and this would just work for them. Now with this one build arg, now overrides going to Docker Hub and starts pulling my local registry internally. So this is kind of the syntax that I use to start using that kind of thing. I'm not going to run through this whole example, but this is what you can start to use in your local builds to try to use your local registry. Is just to pass this stuff as a little build arg that overrides stuff.
All right. And then we have Regbot.
Regbot came when I started to say, I wanted to have a way to do cleanups. I showed you that Docker tag delete or a Docker image delete. We had the two options there. I wanted a way to do a cleanup of some way. And I started thinking, okay, let me make a prune thing. And I wanted to start putting in the YAML file because, we're all stuck with the YAML files at some point. And I started thinking about all the different ways that you can specify a retention policy. And it got really complicated really fast because some people are going to want to keep X number of images. They're going to want to keep images for X amount of time. They're going to want to keep all these different scenarios. Maybe it needs to be an image that matched from a CI build so they know there's a certain label within the image. And so they want to actually query the image, grab a label out of there, see if it's a certain value, and then delete it. There were so many scenarios I was saying, okay, we're getting past the point that I can easily do this with any kind of little YAML file.
Right.
And what I ended up coming up with is I started looking and said, well, whenever your YAML gets too complicated, it turns into a scripting language. And why fight it? Let's just go straight to it. There is an actual scripting language in this. Under the covers, this is what's called Lua. If you go to look from back in the day in the gaming world, anybody that's been a C developer did embedded C, there was a embedded scripting language called Lua. And LUA.
Still used today. Yeah, still used today in games like World of Warcraft.
It is a very popular embedded language because this runs natively within your code. And so this is running natively within Go. It's not even calling C Go under the covers. They have implemented all this stuff natively in Golang, where it's now parsing all this script here that I'm defining. And this, it's not quite Go. It's not quite a bunch of these other things. This is Lua syntax here. But within all of this scripting language that I'm running, I'm going to make calls. And so I'm going to pass a bunch of these little boilerplate things I threw up at the top. When I get into some of this code here, I'm going to say, let me grab, sorry, I need to get far enough down into this. Apologies for all the scrolling. I need to grab a reference. And so I'm going to pass the image name and I need to turn that into a reference in the Docker land that just says, just turn this into an object that I can work with that is a code notation of a image name that you would want to pull down. And I'm going to make another reference for the same image name, but just with my local registry prefix to it. And so this is me saying, let me grab lib or library/alpine and make it the registry port 5000 /library/alpine. So I can start looping through doing those calls. I can start making tag commands that says, let me list all the tags from the upstream repository. Let me go through and start sorting all these tags in Symver order, because that was all the boilerplate above as I was doing a bunch of the Symver stuff. And let me keep only so many of these things. And then as I go through and make this script, I can now say, let me now grab everything that matches a certain regular expression. I had a regex up there somewhere. It says, let me grab everything that is just a 2-dot notation of Symver and grab the last 3 versions of this thing. So I always had the last 3 versions. So I could get really complicated like that. I could get some really complicated scripting like that. And this has got the same image copy command. This is calling the same API calls calling from a bash script. But now I've just got this more, it's all within Lua. So now I can start maintaining variables. I can do my regexes. I can do a bunch of these other things that can't easily be done within bash. So that was one of the scripts. And then this thing just contains multiple scripts. And so I just have another YAML entry here for another script. So this was one that was saying, let me grab all the date stamp entries in there. And then I went down to the bottom of this thing. I said, let me grab the last X number. I think I said grab the last 3. But then after I grab those, let me then check the target registry that I'm pushing this stuff to, and let me delete if I have more than 3. And so this keeps, maybe you're keeping nightly builds and you want to keep the last week nightly builds, you can automatically sync the last 7 days and not have to worry about cleaning up the last 7 days because this script is doing it for you. This is automatically going out there and saying, okay, I've now got 8 days of nightly builds. Let me just delete that last one, the oldest one.
So you can do complicated things like keep the last 3 days of builds unless there haven't been any, and always keep 3, or like keep the last 3 days, but also always keep three of the last versions or whatever. Don't delete everything in case we haven't built in 3 days. Or I can see how that could get really complicated quickly. Is there an easy button?
That is what I want to turn this into. Yeah.
Okay. In case I don't want to use Lua.
That is what it's kind of on the pending to-do list. You saw there was a bunch of boilerplate up top. I want to start taking a bunch of these little scripts here and start to turn it into, here's just generic code snippets, and just fill in a couple variables up top and then dump the rest of this code in there. And this will do this X for you. And then, people can always get more complicated, but all they need to know is, hey, I put my little source image out there, or the image that I'm cleaning up, the tag that I want to clean up, the number of days I want to keep, the image label I'm searching, and then the date format that's in that little field. If you specify those things, all this code is going to go out there and it's going to search all those images and clean up anything that's more than 30 days old. Yeah. And so...
Yeah. Because, there's a lot of teams, especially like solo DevOps people, right? They don't have the complex requirements, but they do, especially if they're going to run a cache, they do need some sort of auto cleanup. So, I can see that there's a middle ground there.
Yeah. And so that's kind of all my to-do list, is to take a bunch of these little pieces of code and turn it into, here's a snippet to do this, here's a snippet to do that, and kind of give you a bunch of those things to pick and choose from that you can now plug in. But that's kind of where this turned into, was I said, okay, there is no easy way to make all these policies out there within a simple YAML file without going to a full-blown scripting language of some kind.
Right.
And I didn't want to turn it into a big bash script and try to have a bunch of variables passed back and forth. And so this was a way to run it within Go. And because I used almost the same backend that I had before for the Regsync, I have things in here like a interval that I can pass through. A number of these things are running in parallel. I've got the registry credentials that I'm passing in up top. So all the same logic that I put in there before, I can put in. And then within the script itself, let me find it real quick. There is something in here, the rate limits that I'm checking. So I can now check the rate limit within the script and just say, hey, did I hit that rate limit or not? And then wait for that to clear for us to get enough images to start doing our pulls. So this turns into a little bit more of a manual process to do the rate limit, just because you might have a bunch of these scripts running concurrently. It got a little complicated, but you've got the function call there to do that.
Yeah, because if you're doing a lot of this stuff in a larger team, your rate limits are going to be changing rapidly. Like those numbers are going to go up and down, especially when they have it's a 6-hour cooldown, right, on the rate limit?
It is a 6-hour cooldown, but it is a rolling 6 hours. And so I've started a bunch of this stuff like 3 hours ago. And so I will get a rolling, X number of pulls back in another 3 hours.
So you got to check often before each action kind of thing. Yeah, I can see how that could be a problem. This is amazing. This is an amazing set of stuff. Yeah. This is great. I had no idea that you had extended this beyond the original like regclient quick demo that I had looked at, when I first looked at the repo. It's really neat stuff. So, all right. So great demos. What is your big ask? Like what can we ask the people that are watching? Like, should they throw in their ideas, try these tools, that kind of thing? I'm going to throw it up on screen one more time so people can see it.
Yeah, I would love for people to give these things a try, to play around with them. I've been using a lot of this stuff against the Docker registry, the little registry:2 image you can pull down locally. I've done a little bit playing around with stuff like the GitHub registry. They've got a couple of those. Make sure I think it's ghcr.io. They've got 2 registries. Make sure you grab the newer one out there. And not every API call works against every registry out there. And so you might run into some of those edge cases where it's just the registry itself doesn't support it all. But there may be some cases out there where I just assume too much out of the spec, and some registry implement it a little bit differently. And so I'd love to hear if there are ever issues people are running into trying it against different environments to find out, where the edge cases are and how I can make this a little better. So
Yeah.
I'd love for people to try it out and, give me some feedback.
Let's see. I got a question from Archimedes. If I had an image that I built using from OpenJDK and publish it to my private repo, it should have all the contents of OpenJDK in my private repo, not just the tagged, right?
It will have all the layers. And so all the parent layers are going to be over there. And then if you were to try to do a mirror of an image into there, we would see that, hey, all the layers already exist. We would just copy the manifest and not all the layers. So yeah, you get that part of it, but the config itself changes, the manifest itself changes. So those parts are different, but those are very small.
Right. So making sure I understand this. So when all of us have image, like most of our images, there's a from in the image, right? Most of us are not doing scratch images on Go binaries. And when I do that, so I have a Node.js app, and there's a from Node.js at the top of my app. And so when I do a regclient image copy command to my local mirror registry or whatever I want to use, it's technically copying my layers and then also that other image's layers, like the from image, right? It's not going to depend on those. Yeah. It's going to mirror all the way up, I guess is what I'm saying, all the way up to the scratch layer.
You will get all those layers. When you actually say from, it pulls down all those layers, downloads everything for you. And all those SHAs for each of those layers stays the same. They never modify back and forth, because those are just a cryptographic checksum based off of all the contents of that layer. And that doesn't change. And so that therefore, when you start doing those copies back and forth, those stay identical.
Yeah.
Even if you move it between a registry, those stay identical.
And I'm assuming that on the new registry, it kind of works like Docker pushes do, where just because my from is from OpenJDK, I'm not necessarily going to see that listed in the library, right? It's not making that image into the registry. I would have to do a copy of OpenJDK separately to make that work, right?
Yeah. As soon as you say that from line, your image starts from that state, and then you keep adding more layers on top of it. And so as you add more layers, you're going to add new file system objects in there. You change the config object a little bit, so you have new stuff in that little JSON file that we were looking at earlier.
Yeah.
Those get added onto it. And so you kind of have this initial state that you start from, and then you just keep extending out with more stuff. And then when you push it, those first 10 pieces of it are identical, but then the next 5 pieces are unique to your build. And you push that whole thing as a setup.
And that's something like I have a team where they kind of have the golden masters, right? So they want you to always use their image registry, mostly due to the pull-through caching problem. So they're using Harbor first, and they have they support Node.js 10, and so they're always keeping mirrors. Probably not using your tool yet, but they should. They're always mirroring all this stuff from Hub. And so it's the hub version of Node.js, of OpenJDK or whatever. And then a lot of their images depend on those. But if they want to see those listed as like root repos in the library, I didn't actually know that was the URL for library, so I learned that too today. So that I could do a pull of Node.js just like I would from Docker Hub, I have to make sure that I'm including those in my copy commands, even though those layers, because really that's what's creating the repo, because I guess that's what you're doing, right? When you do the copy, if it doesn't exist, it's going to create the repo before it pushes up the...
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And so when you do the copy, in this case, the V2 registry image, if you just start to specify a repo that doesn't exist, it just creates it for you. But otherwise, if you're in something like Harbor or some of these other registry servers out there, a lot of times you do need to specify that in advance on your registry server. So
you got to manually create it. Okay. Yeah, there might be a
bunch of them you do.
Yeah. Permissions-based kind of stuff. This is super great, and I knew that we were going to run over, and it was fine because we could talk about this for hours, and like talking about CI workflows and like the typical steps. Like if we were to use all these tools, what would the pipeline look like? If we had an imaginary pipeline, tool agnostic. Like we could talk about that in another show, I'm sure. But this is the kind of the day in day out DevOps kind of stuff that gets lost when we're talking about new shiny tools. We're always talking about Docker and Kubernetes and web GUIs and the latest cloud, blah, blah, blah. But these are the kind of tools that people end up needing day in and day out to just get their work done, whether they're a build engineer or they're the solo DevOps person in their team that has to manage all of this pipeline stuff. So I appreciate you doing this.
So many times I go into a client and I'll do the project and I'll run out the door, a week or two later after we finish up the initial work. And I've had a few that kept me on for longer. And we realized real quick that, we start filling up the hard drive. And so getting the image copied over there, making sure that we're not breaking when something changes upstream, because, you might not find out in 2 weeks, but then later on the latest image does change and suddenly all your pipelines break. So there are a bunch of these challenges that I've found over a longer period of time with clients where we find these day 2 or day 3 challenges where you need to actually clean up our images on the registry without filling the hard drive, where you need to actually mirror the image so that you're not depending on latest from upstream that you don't control. So try to capture a bunch of this stuff.
Okay, we'll do this as the last question, Archimedes. Is there an API, because these are good questions. Is there an API that would check when was the last time an image was downloaded, thinking about Regbot?
Yeah, it doesn't show when the image was downloaded. It shows there's a creation date in the image or in the image config. And so you can see when that image was built if the builder populated that field. And so most of them, if you run something like BuildKit or something like that, it will populate that field, but that only tells you when the image was built, not when you downloaded it.
Yeah, and that's a tricky part too, right? So this is a whole separate discussion. Maybe we shouldn't go into it, but why not? We're here for a second. What is downloaded, right? That was actually a problem when Docker was implementing their hub rate limits and trying to control their bandwidth usage and storage. When they were thinking about rate limits, the captains, we were discussing with them the various ways that you could consider something downloaded, because really an image is a manifest file plus a bunch of different tarballs. And which part of that would you consider the image? At first, if I remember correctly, they were actually counting the layers, and of course, if you had 40 layers, that would be 40 downloads, and then that your rate limit would, if it was the rate limits they have now, you would be killed in a couple of downloads. You could have one image that kills your whole rate limit. So then they decided to do the manifest, right? So the manifest, even though it's a tiny file, usually it's that is considered the thing that is your rate. You've downloaded this image. So in a tool, the tool would probably have to be like the web server that's running your registry would have to just, if the HTTP call was to this JSON file, that was the last download. Is that me?
Yeah.
Making something up that already exists?
Check. You could maybe check on the web server itself, or whatever server we're running here, when that manifest call was run. But yeah, exactly what you're saying is you've got all the layers that are separate there, and which one do you want to count? Because sometimes you don't need to pull the layers. You might already have them.
Yeah. And now that we have these head calls, and it gets a little tricky. And I can see where there would be an attribute. You could have an attribute maybe on a manifest that it's updated every single time and the manifest is pulled, but then you get like this weird nested problem of you're pulling the file in order to write back.
You actually can't. You actually can't do that because the manifest itself is a SHA. And so that is a cryptographic, it cannot change.
Right.
I will say this though, if you go looking at the OCI distribution stuff, and I don't know if it's in distribution or there's also an OCI artifact project as well, there are some discussions about grabbing like some stats. And so you can grab the number of pulls and things like that and to try to make that a registry notation. You can hit that with an API call.
Yeah, so there might be some stuff that's coming down the registry. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a different API call that you could say, tell me about these pulls.
Because Docker Hub has some of these things like 11 million pulls and whatnot. But far as we know, they're doing that on their own with their own special tooling, and yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Good question.
But we might get that out of OCI at some point. So if you're interested in that, go check out OCI. Go get some feedback on some of their PRs.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if all of us are using this spec and we have different needs, we need to let the spec know. So that would be a good place to go do it, is looking up the distribution spec, which we showed off earlier in this video. All right. Well, again, and I just realized that the other time I did have you on this year was for when we did the was it the Swarm show?
Yes.
The
Yeah, we
Swarm
were talking about
2020
Swarm.
show. Yeah. We
Yep,
did that
yep.
as well as some DockerCon. So next time we're going to have you on when you get all this amazing feedback and you have like regclient 2.0.
With all the OCI support and OCI distribution gets 1.0,
Yeah.
we'll get there.
Yeah. So this is great stuff. So you can find him on GitHub. This is the repo under regclient. I've put that in there. You can see that he's sudo Mitch everywhere else, sudo bmitch rather. So you can see his Twitter handle there. You can find him as bmitch on Stackoverflow. And so if you ever see a gentleman in a cowboy hat with a bow tie answering your questions on Stackoverflow, that's this guy. And
most people know that as Matt Smith from Doctor Who.
I only got through a couple of episodes of Doctor Who, so I did not know whose picture that was, but
yeah,
it was
bow ties are cool.
Bow ties are cool. Well, thank you, sir. Thanks for being on the show, and we will see
Thank you,
you
Bret.
all. Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. We're going to be back again this same time next week. I don't. Unfortunately, our guest had to cancel for next week, so we're going to have to come up with a topic. But yeah, we'll be back here next week live. So thank you all. We'll see you on the internet. Ciao.
Take care. Are we?